I'm Sydney Chaffee from Boston, Massachusetts, and I'm the 2017 National Teacher of the Year. Teaching is the best job in the world. It's fun. You get to learn all the time. You get to spend your time with young people who are curious and brilliant and funny, and so you're never bored. Every day is different, and you constantly get to get better and better at it. And the thing that happens when you work with young people is that you have this incredible hope about the future because you're working with the people who are going to inherit it. You're working with the people who are going to run the world in the future. And that's an incredibly inspiring job to have. So I think it's the best job in the world. I also think it's the most important job in the world. Young people inspire me, especially lately there's been a lot of attention nationally on student movements for change and student movements for social justice. And I'm really inspired by those young people, and I'm inspired by their passion and their perseverance and their insistence that the world needs to make changes and that our society and our country and our government need to make changes so that they can grow up in the kind of world that they want to live in. So that's incredibly inspiring to me. I've also always really been inspired by great writing and by art. And so it's always fun for me to get to work with my students on a piece of literature or a poem or a play that I think is incredible and that I think is inspiring, and to watch them sort of discover it as well. I taught the same book for 10 years in a row. And every single year that I taught it, I would find something new in that book through working on it with kids. So kids are definitely the number one thing that inspires me, along with words. Yeah, every year my students get to work with theater professionals from the Huntington Theater, which is this great theater in Boston. And every week, all of my ninth graders get to either go to the theater or the theater comes to them, and they learn how to act over the course of the year. And so by studying plays and by studying poetry and bringing these words to life on stage, my students are actually deepening their literacy skills, and they're discovering these worlds on stage. And they're discovering how to use their own voices, and they're becoming empowered through that. So I've always been secretly a little bit of a theater nerd, and so this part of my job has just allowed that to really be fed and nourished. So that's a really, really fun part of my job. And everything that we do with theater also ties in with the content of my class. So if we're learning about South African apartheid, for example, the kids might put on a play set during apartheid. So it's deepening literacy, it's deepening their understanding of history, and it's empowering for them too. Oh man. I mean, my kids have taught me everything from new slang to, just different perspectives, right? So there are a lot of times where I think I understand something, whether that be a historical event or a text that we're looking at or a current event, and I bring it to my students, and in talking to them about it, or in listening to them grapple with it, they show me a new perspective, or they show me a new way of looking at it. I wish I could think of a specific example for you right now, but I think when we talk to one another as humans, we are constantly learning, right? And when we're opening ourselves up to other people's perspectives and ideas, that's when we're going to learn, and that's when we can expand and grow. And so my job as a teacher gives me chances to do that every day. Every day I get to have these conversations about really complex and interesting things with a whole group of 14 and 15-year-olds who are curious and excited, and their minds are wide open. So that's really fun and inspiring, and has definitely taught me. My school has a focus on social justice. So when I came to work at the school, I knew that, and I was excited about it, and it tapped into some of my own interests in activism and in working for equality and a more just society. But in working at this school for over a decade, I've learned so much about what that work can look like and the power of young people. So in my class, we're really looking at injustice based on colonialism and oppression throughout history. And then we look at, well, how have people throughout history who have faced injustice fought for justice? And even more complicated than that, how have they defined justice and tried to work toward it? When we grapple with that stuff in my ninth grade class, the kids make all sorts of connections to what's happening around them right now. So the majority of my students are African American, and so there are a lot of connections that students make to the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, especially when we're looking at something like the history of resistance against apartheid in South Africa. Students make all sorts of connections between that movement and different things that happened in the history of South Africa and movements for justice that are happening in our country today. My students are incredibly interested in those movements for justice, and it's always really exciting for me to watch them discover those connections and get really excited and say something like, well, wait, if students in South Africa in 1976 could stand up against the government, then maybe students today could do the same thing. Statistics are important. You know, they can tell us a lot, but there's only so far that we can go with statistics before we need to put a human face on them. And so I'm really interested in storytelling and in getting to the heart of who are the people who are behind those statistics, right? What are the stories that live within those numbers? And how can we ensure that when we talk about education, we talk about kids in schools in terms of numbers and data, how can we ensure that we're also humanizing that? And that we're also really understanding what the reality for the human beings living that data looks like. So when I talk to audiences, especially when I talk to audiences that are really used to looking at numbers and not as used to looking at stories, I try to bring both. And I try to really encourage policymakers to get into schools and classrooms and talk to teachers and students so they can learn some of those stories and they can see some of the faces behind the numbers. Numbers can only take us so far. If in education, if all we look at are numbers about schools, we're going to miss a huge piece of the story of what's happening in those buildings, because there are schools all over our country that, based on the numbers, based on the statistics and the data, might be classified as failing schools. But when you actually go into those schools and you see the work that's being put in by the people in the school, there are all these incredible stories of hope and triumph and growth. And so we've got to be able to look at both sides there. So my friend Tom Rademacher was the Minnesota Teacher of the Year in, I think, 2014. He wrote a book for new teachers called It Won't Be Easy. And it's this really honest look at what it is to be in the beginning of your career as a teacher and how difficult it is, but how important it is. So that's a book that just came out recently, but I think all new teachers should get a hold of and should read. A book that's really influenced me in the last couple of years is Christopher Emdin's For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood and the Rest of Y'all Too, which is a great title. And he too is a teacher, and he talks about how teachers, especially white teachers, but the rest of y'all too, right? How we can be more culturally responsive to kids of color in our classrooms, and how we might need to rethink and reshape the way that schools work in order to do right by students of color. So that has had a huge impact on my thinking. I really like the work of Lisa Delpit. Yeah, those are like the big ones that come to mind that I always tell people that they have to read. Yeah, this is a good story. So I wanted to be, I wanted to be a poet, and I went to college to be a poet. I went to Sarah Lawrence, and I was studying poetry with this amazing poet. He has won a Pulitzer, like he's great. And at the end of the year, I had written all this poetry, and we were sitting and talking about what I was going to do next. And he told me that I wasn't meant to be a poet. And I didn't know what to do, you know, because that had been my plan. I was going to be a poet. I was going to change the world through my poetry. And I've told this story a lot of places, and I told it recently, and he was in the audience, and he came up to me afterward, and he said, "You're not telling the whole story. You have to tell people that the reason I said you couldn't be a poet was because you were too well-adjusted." So now I have to tell people that part so he doesn't get upset. So he said, okay, I'm too well-adjusted to be a poet. I have to figure out what else I want to do. So I'm studying, I'm taking a lot of creative writing courses, but not poetry. I'm taking women's history courses. And I'm in love with what I'm doing. I loved being a student at Sarah Lawrence. My brain was on fire. I was so excited to be there. I never wanted to leave. And so I had this epiphany one day when I was a junior that I should stay at Sarah Lawrence forever. And the way that I would do that was by becoming a professor. So I go into my professor's office, my women's history professor, and she's amazing. You know, I love her. And I say to her, I'm going to be you, and I'm going to stay here forever. I'm going to be a professor, and I'll teach here, and it'll be amazing. So it turns out, her name is Lita Sizer. It turns out she's the daughter of Ted and Nancy Sizer, who are these famous educators and authors on education and ed reformers. Ted Sizer started the Coalition of Essential Schools to sort of rethink what should schools look like. And so she said, I want you to read my dad's book, and then I'm gonna send you into one of his schools, and we'll go from there. And that sort of started this journey of looking at younger people and thinking, oh, maybe I don't have to be a professor. Maybe I could work with younger people. And yeah, that's where it started. So I was a junior in college and realized that this was the path I wanted to take. And when I looked back at my life, it all made sense. My mom had been a teacher. I used to do grammar workbooks for fun. All of the pieces fell into place, but I just hadn't seen it before that. And my first answer is that my daughter inspires me because she's 3, and watching her learn is fascinating to me. And it's teaching me a lot about what it means to be a teacher. Ever since I became a parent, my perspective on teaching and on working with families and working with kids has changed a little bit. I feel more empathy towards kids and families and just how difficult it is to learn and to grow up and to try and figure this whole thing out and navigate the school system. But watching my daughter learn how to write her name was really incredible to me, and was really inspiring to me because I'm witnessing the growth of someone's brain. I'm witnessing them learning how to do things that I never thought about. Well, how do people learn that? By the time they come to me in 9th grade, I'm not teaching them how to write in that way. And so to be able to watch that is really inspiring and really cool. The other thing that is really inspiring to me personally is to go to places where history has happened. And I mean, history has happened everywhere, so that could be any place, but to go to sites where I know that something incredibly historic has happened. So today I'm here in Little Rock, Arkansas, and I just ran over in an hour that I had and went to Central High and learned a little bit more about the Little Rock Nine and what happened on that site. And so to stand in a place and to think about what happened and the impact that that had on our country is really exciting for me and really inspiring. So anytime I get to travel and I get to see the places that I've learned about or read about, that inspires me.